Okay, we got with us here Yaron Matras. You have just written a new book about multilingualism, and your focus is apparently mostly on Manchester, the role of multilingualism in the city. What is the main focus of the book?
So the setting of Manchester is an example. The book is about the mechanisms in the interaction between communities and institutions, the public discourse, and academics, so all of those different players, around recognizing, identifying multilingualism, and translating that recognition and the experience of encounters with different languages into practice in various institutional settings within the cities, and the attitudes and ideologies that accompany that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're talking about multilingualism, but apparently the term is not that clear-cut in its meaning. What does it refer to, actually?
Yes, well, in a traditional sense, multilingualism is often seen as several different languages, accumulation of different languages, which sort of presupposes that it's easy to identify the boundaries between them. But the approach that I take in the book, together with many others who work in the area, I mean, I'm not the only one who says that, is that we should look at multilingualism much more as a repertoire of linguistic resources that users have at their disposal and deploy in different ways, in different situations, and for different purposes. The concept of multilingualism that I want to understand and explore and push is one of a much more fluidity of resources and routines that are deployed in different ways at the discretion of users and can be enhanced more easily. And that also means that language is not just something that we learn at school to pass an exam. It can be impressions, it can be encounters, it can be knowledge about language. And I give some examples of how, if you think of, in those terms of language policy, in the academic discussion and the political discussion, for example, European institutions like the Council of Europe that have a language policy division, language policy is usually seen as something that is scripted and targets what is easily recognized and identifiable as a language, and delegates the authority to do that to particular institutions, in particular in education and culture, often through translation or safe spaces for particular languages. In our understanding of language as a much more dynamic and fluid repertoire of language resources, encounters are also part of that knowledge, encounters of languages, and taking initiative, assuming some kind of agency when you're working within an institution, and taking initiative to build and deploy that knowledge that you have, not necessarily of language, but even about language, can be an instigator to some kind of policy change at the micro level. And one example for it is if you have, say, a hospital setting, and somebody says to a patient, well, you want something small, not necessarily clinical intervention, but some kind of communication. We can't talk to you because we don't have an interpreter. Somebody else says, well, we don't, but we have another staff member who's Polish, and we know from our experience that the Polish person can also understand Czech because they're similar. So this person did not pass a language exam. They don't have a degree. They're not scripting a policy. There's no protocol, but there is just accumulated knowledge, and that knowledge is accumulated through their experience in working in the multilingual setting of the city. So the city with its high density, and the city for me is the same, that's what I'm saying, Manchester is an example, but it's an example of urban setting where there is a high density of languages, and so inevitably people who work in public service providing agencies or teaching or others, they through their encounters, they accumulate knowledge, and the confidence given to them to say, I'm going to act on that knowledge about language can be a game changer in terms of how interactions can facilitate the services that they provide, and people feel comfortable. And that's why the city is an interesting environment for me to look at these things.
It's about practicality. It's not about having the specific diploma or a training in a language, but it's like the example that you've given. Now, I'm kind of wondering, maybe we should flip the question around and ask the question, is there actually any place in the world that is still monolingual? Except maybe, I would imagine, the countryside of England. The only language there would be English then. But apart from that, isn't being multilingual part of everyday life?
Certainly in cities, yeah. Certainly in cities. And in the countryside, in many areas, you have a different kind of trend. You have regional languages that are often in decline, being superseded or dominated by other languages. You have a different kind of multilingualism.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of Friesland, for example, you've got several layers. The Fries and Dutch, and Saxon, and English coming out and outside. So there is, and that's the kind of regional multilingualism that in the European institutional political context has been acknowledged for many years, since sort of the late 1980s.
There's the Charter on regional languages.
The Charter on regional languages, and a lot of work that has been done both in the European Commission and also in the Council of Europe. And has then inspired other institutions as well at various state and regional levels. But where we're still far behind, and a lot of work is to be done, is acknowledging the diversity of languages in urban settings. It's a much bigger challenge because not only is the number of languages greater, but there is more fluctuation, there's more change, there is a different level of claiming ownership. So if we stick with Friesland, you've got the local associations, you've got people that they have some confidence now after many decades of oppression in Wales as well, but there's now regained the confidence, and there's local institutions that say this is our region, this is our language. In cities, the claim is not necessarily for physical space. This is our neighborhood, this is our Moroccan dialect of Arabic. It doesn't quite work like that in a neighborhood in Antwerp. So you have to find a new idea a new way to build in appreciation of languages and language diversity into a civic identity. And it's very different. That celebrating or acknowledgement of multilingualism as part of a civic identity is a very different narrative to the regional languages, because in the regional languages it's very much about the right of precedence. We were here first, so we're authentic, and it's our claim to precedence that from which we derive the claim to maintain the language. In the urban setting, it's we were here later, we come from somewhere else, we are connected to other places, and we're not unique. We don't have exclusivity. And yet, there is a belonging to the city. It's a very, very different type of argument, and it's emerging, but it's not always acknowledged institutionally.
I think another contrast would be for the regional languages. Often this is the expression, they move to the city to die there. It's in the cities that the regional languages often start disappearing the first. Like, for example, Cardiff being the capital of Wales, the language has gone away there. The same for Leeuwarden in Friesland. Is in those regional languages, they don't really flourish that well in the big cities, whereas the migrant languages do.
Well, that's simply because they lose their exclusivity. So, they're there alongside many other languages, so they're no longer as present.
But they were never really present before the big migrations. Like Welsh has been disappearing from Cardiff long before the recent waves of migration, of course.
Okay, but then it's not about moving to the city that makes them lose the language. On the other hand,
they have a very different experience.
No, on the other hand, one of the biggest communities of Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic speakers is in Glasgow. And,
that's true.
The fact that there's a big community in the city allows them to operate schools, Sunday schools or whatever, or even schools that... Till recently, there was a school in Paris that was a Breton medium school, and it had more pupils, I believe, than in the whole of Bretagne. That closed down recently, unfortunately. It's around the COVID thing, it lost. But these are examples. So that there are counter examples. Yiddish survives in cities. It survives in Antwerp. It survives in Manchester and in London
and in New York.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you have in your studies, is there anything that you would say would be like an indicator for the strength of a language, how it can survive in a city?
If you are worked on that, I'm not. That wasn't I wasn't looking for a statistical indicator.
I would imagine the number of people that actually speak it there will be a minimum threshold that you will need to. If, for example, the Yiddish community here in Antwerp, they have a sufficient number to be self-sustaining. I imagine that would be a part of it, of course.
Well, there's a chapter where I report on a study that we did in Manchester schools.
And we asked several questions. These were pupils between the ages of something like 8 and 14, if I remember correctly. We asked them to name languages that they used. We asked a few questions about who they used them with, whether they had, any exposure to reading and writing and films and television. And we also did a short test, as it were. We asked them to say a few things, and we didn't test their grammar or anything like that. We just tested the spontaneity, how spontaneous and fluent they were, and gave an indicator. It's a very rough indicator, but gave us an idea for whatever language they wanted to name. So we didn't pinpoint, we didn't say this person has to have this or that. We just asked them, what would you? The two languages, and there were probably between 40 and 50 languages in those 4 schools that we looked at. The two languages that had the highest score alongside English in terms of the proficiency, the fluency, the spontaneity, were Arabic and Romani. But the correlates were very, very different. For Arabic, there was the highest percentage of people who attended weekend schools, read in the language, were being read to in the language, had television and films. For Romani, the lowest percentage, because there's no Romani television, there's no Romani fields, there's no Romani schools, there's no Romani literacy. And yet the level of maintenance was highest, which means that for different communities there are different factors, and that's why the question about is there an indicator, I kind of look at it, it's very contextual, there are different indicators for different communities. I don't think there is the one and only predictor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised about the Romani. So I didn't know there were so many in England speaking the language.
Well, Romani, traditionally the population that spoke Romani in England abandoned the language in the second half of the 19th century. They maintain a vocabulary, so there's a kind of a English ethnolect, you could call it, a way of speaking English within the community, and it includes a lot of Romani words. But the Romani speakers are immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe. So those who speak Romani now are first or second generation immigrants from Poland, Slovakia, Romania, mainly.
So there was a contingent of Romani people that lived there longer before, and they lost their language, and now there's a new wave coming. It's sort of similar like the Jewish migration that went to Antwerp, because there was a Yiddish-speaking population, Western Yiddish, in Amsterdam long ago, and they lost their language, and then now they speak Eastern Yiddish. That's more recent.
Well, don't get me started. I'm a heretic critic of the term Western Yiddish. One of my earliest publications was on the topic. I don't believe in a Western Yiddish. I think Western Yiddish is an analytical back projection from Eastern Yiddish. What there was a Judeo-German ethnolect, which was part of a German sociolinguistic continuum. And Jews in the German-speaking areas and the surrounding areas. So basically what is the so-called Western Yiddish is actually a Judeo-German variety. It was part of the German language continuum. Jews spoke slightly differently. Yiddish developed in Eastern Europe. Also the self-appellation of the language was Deutsch. I mean, nobody said West Deutsch and West Yiddish. That doesn't exist. There's never been a self-appellation, nor East Yiddish. My grandmother said her language was Yiddish, because by the time, after the immigration or expulsion into Eastern Europe, it became the specific way that Jews talked, which was very different to what the environment spoke. And that's when they started to call it Yiddish. Before it was called Deutsch, or Yiddish Deutsch, if you wanted to differentiate. So it was called Deutsch in opposition to Loshen Kodesh, which was the Holy Tongue, which was Hebrew, which was the language of Scripture. So in opposition to that, it was Deutsch. Deutsch is even a verb in English even. So Orthodox Jews will say, I'll Deutsch it for you, I'll explain it to you, which means I'll gloss it for you. You know, that word survives still.
We actually have a similar expression in Dutch, diets maken.
Ja, iemand iets diets maken. Ja.
Yeah, that's a similar expression.
Yeah.
To explain someone in a clear and understood language, you could say, that they can understand. Yeah, it's interesting.
So that's an example of a language that well, it's a kind of new language that came into existence. Because earlier we talked about languages disappearing, but there are also new languages appearing. I think, like, I mean, in the Middle Ages everybody spoke Latin, it was a common language, and then at a certain point people started recognizing that Italian and Spanish were actually not dialects but languages. And don't you think that, like, Dajira in Morocco is now at the point of more and more being recognized as a separate language instead of as a dialect of Arabic?
I think what's happening now with dialects of Arabic, for example, is that social media gives them prominence, because the fact that people are now comfortable, social media has basically leveled off, I mean, usually we have, there's informal personal spoken and formal impersonal public written. But social media has kind of messed the whole thing up. So there's informal, public, personal, where the style of the oral is used but in the written form. That's universal. It's not just particular to languages, but
maybe
that makes it easier for people to spontaneously write. And as that emerges, you know, it's conventionalized to some extent, not with rules that are strict, but you know, there are certain conventions of using abbreviations and using other things. And so you get communities, you get practice communities without there being institutional regulation. There are practice communities that, I don't want to say self-regulate, but self-conventionalize. So you kind of adhere to a certain kind of norm or convention, which is dynamic, it changes, but it's there. And that allows to break away and give much more status. It expands the domain. So for some languages, if we go back to Romani, for example, until very recently, Romani was not written. Just a handful of people used it in writing, very, very few. But now, most people that I know, if they speak Romani, they will also send text messages in Romani without having ever gone to school or thought about spelling. They just do it spontaneously, just like people do in other. So it puts a lot of languages on the map in that sense, and they become acknowledged.
Is there a parallel with the invention of the printing of books, and at that point that the more, well, like Italian, that the languages that were not very official started being used?
What you are explaining about the Romani, apparently a similar thing is going on with Tamazight. And nowadays in Antwerp, and I suppose in other cities as well, the youth is picking up Tamazight language and culture, and actually also reading and writing in it and making TikTok videos in that language. And they have picked up a language that was, until a few decades ago, actually considered like some marginal thing. And now
it's almost universal. I mean, it's kind of all over the world. That's the case, absolutely. So it gives languages a new area of vitality. And it's easier also to learn, because people then don't need the face-to-face context in order to expand their language as well, and also expand it in terms of vocabulary.
But on the other hand, it happens in an urban setting, and I see that happening with the young people, for example, the children. They when they get together, they are actually sharing like TikTok videos in the language. And so you got the two sides. You got the actual physical being together in the city, in quarters of the city, where there's a lot of Tamazight people living together, and then there's the digital side, you could say, that supports it or steers it or enforces it. And that's
why I'm saying it doesn't substitute, it adds a new domain, and that enriches. And that helps support many, many languages. And that also makes it much more of a grassroots phenomenon, democratizes it, if you will, because it's not regulated. And that's the big difference to the printing, that yes, printing popularized vernacular languages, but it still required sponsorship from institutions or states or state-like governments. And it was the printing and the choice of the vernacular
along with the Reformation, of course, which at the same time was meant that Latin was no longer lost some of its status in the Protestant churches. That led to the emergence of national languages. So what happened there is that, again, that was institutionalized. So national languages versus the regional
goes in waves.
So the hierarchies came up. But I think the social media is not quite a repetition of that, because it's not quite within that domain of control. It's much more wider and it's much more enriching. There are, however, again, to stick with Romani, it was only last June, I believe, that Google Translate added Romani. And before that, it had one variety of Kurdish, for example, and then since added another variety of Kurdish. So Google Translate is expanding, and it's becoming a major kind of instrument. And it's early days, but it's possible that will set a trend. If it chooses a particular variety and a particular spelling, that people will adjust to that. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different kind of authority. And it's, I don't want to kind of go and say, what we're seeing now with oligarchs and big tech companies taking control of power in certain states and beyond that. But it's certainly within, in a sort of a similar trend, that now the power comes not necessarily from state institutions, but from big tech companies. And not necessarily with the intention of exerting power over spelling, but with the byproduct.
Yes.
The intent, that's been actually quite criticized by many. I mean, the intention is actually to expand the what's on offer, and to allow more people to participate in the digital community. But the effect that it can have is to semi-regulate, even without the intention of regulation. We'll see. It's early days.
You've got two opposing forces clashing into each other, basically. Because it is a fact that more and more of the what we would call minority languages are finding a place online. But then you got the clash. Okay, now when you write something, you have to use a certain standardized orthography or something, or what vocabulary do you use?
I don't see the clash as so strongly pronounced, because alongside with the development of digital things, you also have tools that tolerate and understand fuzziness. So in fact, it's easy to spell in different ways and still be understood. I work with it the other way around. I work with corpora, and of course, the more uniform, if let's just say we're transcribing the speech of several people in a community, but each of them has a slightly different pronunciation. We want a tool that can understand everything, and we can program the tool to understand the variation. And that means that the variation can be tolerated. But, it's a question of just how much is that implemented in very standard tools like the translation tools.
Yeah, that brings us to the AI, the future, what the future will be with AI in those applications. I imagine that 5 years from now, the language landscape in cities might have be impacted by AI tools, because you see that nowadays that people don't actually need to learn a language anymore. They simply scan a text and translation appears on the screen. So that might actually have quite a significant impact in the long run with how people of different languages.
Well, it has. Look, there are people who are in the business of being academics of the future. It's not my line of work, but what I observe is that people have more tools at their disposal. If we come back to some examples that I actually give in the book on interaction in the hospital context, we interview people about how do you get by with the language that you know or don't know. And they tell us there's a range of options. If I'm going to the hospital and I know that it's a very difficult procedure, then I ask for an interpreter. But if I'm just going to the dentist and it's basic things that I can manage, I rely on myself. In between, I'm going to another doctor, I'm going to a pharmacy to pick something up. I know that there's something there, an assistant who speaks a language that's a bit similar to mine. And if I'm going to this doctor, then I take a translation tool with me on my phone, because basically I can speak, and then he doesn't have to get an interpreter, because otherwise the interpreter would be on telephone, and that's inconvenient. And people, so that's again what I was saying before about the range of encounters and experiences from both sides, if you will, the agents and the clients, the professionals and the patients, depending on who, but on both sides of that, there's a range, it gives a range of flexibility. which makes policy a much more dynamic area, because before policy was somebody who's in charge of the institution writes a protocol, this is how everybody has to do it, and then you have to create the infrastructure. You have to need the personnel and whatever else. Here it makes everything much more dynamic. Potentially risks also arise because not everything is under the predictability and control. But you give more agency to the participants. That's what's happening. And I mean, that's been described in academic research, and it's kind of some of the observations that I think it's not yet completely acknowledged from an institutional perspective. The institutions are very much behind yet in
slow
seeking the control.
Yeah.
Yes, and the domains of responsibility. How far can we take? Are we responsible if something goes wrong? Who's got the liability? That's another issue.
Yeah.
But I think the AI means that we just have yet more options. So the options are expanding.
Okay. I think your restaurant is awaiting you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your.